And before we go into that briefly, I just want to complete the thought about what it is in the symmetry of waves that produces fractality and therefore the triggering of hydrogen. And for this discussion, we're going to look at how flux lines, how waves of charge would need to travel in order to produce self-organization, fractality, phase conjugation, and the triggering of hydrogen. So what we're looking at on this screen is I guess you could say, a romanticized image of how self-organization is produced in phase conjugate optics. So in optical theory, which is the one place where self-organization is well documented in physics, using phase conjugation, the way it's done is called four-wave mixing. Now, as we discuss this, I want you to consider that while we're talking about the path that light is traveling to converge in this geometry, which I call phase conjugate, that we're going to then apply this to the way electric fields travel between the plates of a capacitor in Brown's gas. And we're going to apply this to the way magnetic flux lines travel in magnetic phase conjugation when we heal water and produce germination. So this discussion about optical theory is we're going to apply them directly to our understanding of the triggering of bioactive fields. And more on that tomorrow. So, the way you make phase conjugation as optics, you get four lasers precisely angled to approach each other and, as it were, annihilate each other head-on. I always tell people, imagine you had two pine cones that were meeting head-to-head and they were getting screwed, so to speak. That screwing process of one pine cone into the opposite pine cone like this is a very key image. Remember we had that picture of the 10 spirals of the golden mean. As the phase velocities add and multiply, as the two opposing lasers or magnetic beams or dielectric beams approach, if they approach each other from opposite directions, like two triangles approaching each other from opposite directions, and as the two triangles cross each other, like this, you get an area in the center at the cross point of the two triangles, which is called phase conjugate. In that place, the phase velocities, adding and multiplying, think of it as plasma, or in this case it would be light, produce heterodynes, that is, adding and multiplying wavelengths and velocities. An infinite series of them in phi nit, based on golden ratio. And so the plasma in the center becomes implosive and centripetal, and it begins to sort its environment. It's very profound because, first of all, the very nature of phase conjugation is broad spectral. That means if you start in the optics, don't be surprised if you get into almost all of the other spectra, RF, infrared, etc. And the same thing's true of magnetics and dielectrics. Because the adding and multiplying is sending the waves through all its harmonics, idealizing golden ratio, you get information from opposite ends of the spectrum, and all the waves meet here. Now, to give you an idea of how profound this is, and I tell you, there is no more profound secret in the universe, in my view, than right here, what's happening at the center of phase conjugation. For example, I just found out that the turning point of when Nostradamus figured out how to arrange the electric field around his scrying water to see the future, there's a giant pentacle around, and this is and we must credit Vincent Bridges here, and I'm not going to reveal the whole secret, but around Saint-Remy, where Nostradamus actually set up his tower. And the reason his scrying water was able to allow him to see the future was precisely because the geometry of the magnetic lines going through it was doing that. That just gives you an idea, because the plasma that in the center becomes implosive is now sucking in the phase velocities, which are superluminal, called the future. It's really, this mystery, this is absolutely the key to the physics of alchemy. It goes on and on. This is the most profound metaphor you'll ever discover, is what's happening at the center of phase conjugation. In terms of optics, the mystery has always been what constitutes the nonlinear mirror, which is to say what material you put where the two lasers meet head-on to create self-organization. We now know, thanks to my hypothesis, that the electric geometry of the phase conjugate optic nonlinear mirror would actually have to produce this kind of phase path for the light lines. Now that's a whole other subject we're not going into right now, but it is related to our little mystery of hydrogen, because when we build our capacitor, the plates of the condenser around the place where the hydrogen atom is being taught to implode, in both the Joe cell and the Brown's gas device, you have the plates of the capacitor. Now, the insulator between the plates of that capacitor is called the dielectric. And the nature of that insulator is the magic. Whatever you put in that little spark gap determines whether the electric lines of charge are doing this phase conjugate. Just to give you an example, when you put palladium, which happens to be dodecahedral, between the plates of a capacitor, you just reinvented the automotive industry because they now have palladium batteries based on those plates, and they are phase conjugate. It's very, very profound stuff. So I'm just giving you a few hints of how beautiful and powerful this physics is. Now, since we want to turn this into myth, sometimes myth is good. So I'm going to give you a little mythology about this phase conjugate nature of life, and in this case hydrogen, by telling you just a 5-minute short story. Here's the short story. I happen to believe the history of the gene pool story told by this author named Anton Parks, Chronicles of Girku. I think it's a good history story. I recommend it. And he was talking about this Girku ME crystal, a digital voice recorder of Enki. Whether you believe the story or not, he happens to be agreeing in part with the other scholar that you may know of, named Ahmed Osman, whose book is called Out of Egypt. And they're both describing the history of this person you might be familiar with. His name is Hermes, whose symbol is the caduceus, which in physics is known as phase conjugation. Now, Uncle Enki was playing a little joke on us when he invented the nickname for Ningishita, which is Sumerian for later Hermes Thoth. Because his nickname, Thoth, is called Tehuti. Tehuti, right? Which, if we believe Ahmed Osman, was later abbreviated TWT, which was shortened from the Aramaic to DWD, which is pronounced Dawid, or the line of David. So according to Ahmed Osman, every time you read of the line of David in the Bible, you're actually reading about the history of the bloodline of Thoth. For example, Thutmose, the name of the Egyptian kings, etc. So if you dissect the term, what he's actually doing is referring to a waveguide principle, te-hu-te, which is that if you cross two T's across a mirror, a phase conjugate point, and our friend Sean would appreciate this. This is part of what Sean does in his study of these letters in a whole level and fun way as well. But the point is that at the place where the two opposing T's cross each other through a mirror, two opposing triangles, you have the hu point. Te-hu-te. Hu is one of the only vowels that has a harmonic spectra that's a pure tone, a single frequency. And when you cross two opposing triangles, phase conjugating, what comes out the center is purified, as it's sorted, made pure. Te-hu-te. And if you bring those two opposing light triangles together, the shadow of that is called the Star of David, the Mogan David, the flag of Alpha Draconis and Israel, and a picture of the physics of phase conjugation, if you would believe. So the very name of Tehuti was actually more than the gematria. It was the three-dimensional physics of telling you phase conjugate and you will have the secret of life, Li-Phi, etc. So that is the end of our 5-minute story of the origin of the caduceus, symbol of Hermes, doctors, healing, DNA, and Thoth Tehuti. That caduceus being called phase conjugation in physics. So that was just a little background story to give you a little sense of how important it is to understand this concept of what happens when waves meet from opposite directions and cause that implosive centripetal force. Now, before we apply that to hydrogen, I'd like to give you just a short introduction to tomorrow's lecture. Tomorrow's lecture is about how bioactive fields are created. Phase conjugate dielectrics, phase conjugate magnetics. In one of those cases, we're going to be talking about how we assemble the magnets to create a device that can theoretically take sewage water to drinking water in almost one pass. What we do know so far is we measured a 300% growth effect. Now it turns out that we array those magnets in an array where there are 9 phase conjugate gaps lined up. And we learned how to do that because of the living nature of plasma. Plasma becomes alive when the electric fields nest in a certain way. And the symmetry of that nesting of electric domains in the plasma to make life is the subject of what we deal with tomorrow. And it relates directly to what we're going to talk about in terms of hydrogen in just a moment. So what I wanted to share with you was a little bit about the physics of how plasma domains work. Now, many of you know that you can derive the Sri Yantra as archetype from 9 three-dimensional interdigitated golden ratio tetrahedra. Do you see that? I've got 9 three-dimensional tetrahedra on the top right. And if I interdigitate them properly in 3D, the shadow is called the Sri Yantra. In effect, what I have is 9 opposing pairs of cones. I repeat, 9 opposing pairs of cones. And that creates the physics of how plasma would create self-organization. Now, there's this fun movie, it's called The Last Mimsy. And the kids learn that by using the Sri Yantra, they can control the stars. They can control the energy grid. They can control life. And the companion movie I recommend is called Whale Dreamers, funded by John Lennon's son. And the Whale Dreamers is referring in part to this plasma storm that hits South Australia off the Bight every 6,000 or so years. And the Los Alamos physics group spent years modeling what that plasma storm looked like. And I mention this because it's an instructive lesson on the nature of life. That Los Alamos Plasma Physics Laboratory, a large number of their staff devoted many years to this study, and they concluded that the geometry of that plasma had 9 nested donuts, one above each other. And they concluded from the computer modeling that the way plasma would self-organize requires actually 9 donuts nested. In exactly the same way as you have 7 plus 2 chakras, and the 9 steps to Palenque, and the 9 roofs of the pagoda, and the Egyptian Ennead, and the Greek Ennead, and the Dante's Inferno, and the Enneagram of Gurdjieff, etc., 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 etc. So the 9 is very significant because it is the physics of plasma. Now, after they finished doing all this physics at Los Alamos, they walked out into their parking lot and they found that the computer model they just did of the shape of the donuts in the plasma storm had been carved by the Native American Indians on the petroglyphs in their parking lot about 1,000 years earlier. So apparently they had done some plasma physics earlier. And so they realized that the tribal shamans all over the world had seen this plasma storm and they had carved it on their petroglyphs. Now this story might carry us a little bit here, but I want to pursue it just a moment. A friend of mine named John McGovern in Flinders Range in Adelaide, near the Bight in Australia, was working with the Adnyamathanha Indian tribe and had discovered all these carvings on the cave walls of the Aboriginals, the Adnyamathanha tribe, which showed the Ophanim alphabet and the Seraphim alphabet and Hebrew alphabet letters, and the symbol for their Valnapa, Adawi, was actually, as Ophanim, the symbol was actually the symbol for golden mean. It was carved on these ancient cave walls. And after, to make a long story short, John McGovern became an expert on ancient indigenous petroglyph carvings. And after a while, he believed he could interpret and read every ancient petroglyph carving symbol system on Earth. He can interpret most any carving there is. And he calls the alphabet letters on those carvings, he calls them plasma residues. The shadow of an electric field, which is how a shaman penetrates into a plasma storm, a tornado. And now this all sounds a bit romantic, but it's now, John McGovern is the co-author of hundreds of papers on plasma physics with the Los Alamos research team for this reason. They even found that they could determine which tribe had painted these petroglyphs by the latitude, they could determine the latitude of the shaman who made the carving by how high up on the neck was the plasma donut. So clearly, the shaman are saying, you know, Vishnu, Shiva, however you want to call God, call it Vishnu, lives in this wave envelope. And this is the plasma coming from the sun. This is what the whale dreamers needed to dream in order to not just call the whales, but project their plasma into the solar wind and inhabit the stars, as in the physics of embedding. Now that's a little bit advanced material. You didn't know you were going to hear that in a class on hydrogen, did you? The reason I brought that up was to give you an idea of how it is that plasma fields can fuse and embed into larger star systems. If you look from a scene from the movie Last Mimsy, you see this double spider's web vortex cone pair there, and you see that they're studying how it is to project plasma in order to create power. At one point in the film, you see that when they use the Sri Yantra, they actually, the public utility power grid switches out. They actually create a plasma storm locally. So the point is that if you nest these phase conjugate pairs of opposing cones correctly, collectively the plasma domains or donuts assemble themselves into a living body. It's literally the physics of what we call politics. A politic comes from the Greek word the body polis, which means if you have a body that is projecting plasma, you have a polis. And again, this is more intro to tomorrow, what we're going to talk about how living biologic plasma becomes alive. But in this sense, you obviously cannot be political unless you have some plasma to project. In other words, no bliss, no politics. In other words, somebody forgot to tell George Bush that the purpose of having a government was so that people could experience bliss, because that's how your plasma gets projected. So all of this is about learning how biologic plasma becomes self-organized, and the symmetry lessons that are contained are what this is about. So I wanted to mention that because this is what's behind our study of hydrogen. Hydrogen, as we discussed before, remember, you've had 2 lectures now looking at the symmetry of the heart of hydrogen. Remember, many of you are familiar with what's called the anu from Theosophy, Leadbeater, and Bassan. You remember what the symmetry of the anu is? That if you look at, let's look at what makes a tornado self-organizing and see if we can understand what lives at the heart of hydrogen, and that'll give us an introductory lesson to our lesson about the electricity of hydrogen and how we make that for ourselves. That if you look at the center of a tornado forming, and we've done this many times, the center of this tornado, this happens to be Katrina, the center of this tornado, which is sort of what's at the heart of hydrogen, if we believe Nassim tomorrow, that at the heart of atoms is a black hole. The tornado vortex at its heart has a pentagram, a 5-sided figure. There's a reason the pentagram has a 5-sided plasma at the center, because that's phase conjugate and implosive, and what causes a centripetal force that makes the tornado able to steer itself. When a shaman steers a tornado, he embeds his plasma, his own bioplasmic streamers, into the tornado. He feels the pain of the tornado. With using compassion, his heart turns inside out recursively, and that creates a centripetal suction effect in his heart. And as his heart turns inside out recursively, his electric field embeds a longer and longer wave until his plasma can become the heart of that tornado. The physics of perfect embedding or perfect nesting being the core issue here. We call this embeddability. And this is not Introduction to Playboy magazine. It is rather the physics of embedding. That what allows a small donut non-destructively to enter a bigger donut. Uh-oh, this thing got damaged in transit, Valerie. Oh dear. So there's a little donut inside the big donut, and unfortunately, the embedding principle is a little bit askew here. Gotta fix my toys. Anyway, what allows a little donut inside a bigger donut is idealized by golden ratio. That's called embeddability or perfect nesting. And that's idealized, obviously, by golden mean ratio. So literally, how you get in the mind of God, as it were, is your electric field becomes embeddable. Or using the physics terms, that this ability to embed is how the electric field of a virus is tested for its ability to embed on a membrane. The virus gets access to the membrane if the harmonics of the wave allow it to screw in and embed. So the physics of embedding is idealized by fractality and golden ratio. And if you were to then see how your plasma gets nested as a short wave in a long wave, so that you become the center of gravity of an electric field that's bigger than your body, let's call it a tornado, that if you were to map the angle at which that tornado learns how to feed itself, you would have this particular slip knot, the perfect Gordian knot. Oh, thank you, Paul, you're a hero. He fixed our toys. What a wonderful. Okay, so we got to show this. It's so much fun. I need to credit Dennis Lee for building this testing model here. But this is the small donut, this is the big donut. The golden ratio and perfect phase discipline allows the little donut to non-destructively embed in the bigger donut. You see that? Isn't that really cool? So the short wave was not hurt by living inside the longer wave. This is how you get inside the mind of Gaia, the mind of God. Perfect nesting or embedding. And that's called the divine. Perfect branching, perfect nesting, perfect embedding. And that's a physics. And that embeddability is optimized by this particular slip knot, the Anu, which, if you were to extrapolate, becomes this map of what the clairvoyant saw at the center of hydrogen, the Anu, was later documented in the physics text by Phillips in UK, Psi Perception of Quarks, where he showed that the clairvoyants were the first to correctly predict the subatomic particles of hydrogen, actually. The clairvoyants found it before the physicists did. It's real. So when they saw this Anu, they weren't kidding. Now the model is actually poetic, but the physics is that 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside. The 5 spins inside, this slip knot, refers to the pent symmetry array, 5 cubes in a dodeca, which is nested inside, thank you, yes, and also in here we have the cubes are inside. I have 5 cubes that could nest inside this model. Let's see if we turn this back here, then our global audience could see this as well. Or are we having fun yet? Okay, so this is called the star mother, and inside you have a cube and a dodeca. Thank you. It's just, yes, and here we have thank you. Here we have the stars within stars, the pent symmetry. So there are really only 2 major fundamental symmetry groups. One of them is tetracubic. In the tetracubic, oh, thank you. Oh, and for tonight's show, Jonathan Quentin is going to spin these in strobe lights, and children go into trances. You have fluorescence and black light and strobes. And thank you, Jonathan. In here, indeed, we have beautiful. The tetracube. The tetracube is here in pink, inside the dodeca, which is in purple. Now, as I was saying, you have 2 fundamental symmetry groups. One is tetracubic, which has 7 axes of spin, and the other is pent dodeca, where you have 6 pairs of vortex and a pent symmetry. Now, there's 2 points I want to make about this. Why am I bringing this up to teach you about hydrogen? You have a certain amount of electric charge which is nested in a symmetry, tetracubic, which has 7 axes of spin. If I take the dodeca ecosa, and I do this is a stellated tetra called a cuboctave. If you compress it in this way, and you were to actually map this change of path, called the jitterbug, you would actually be doing a map of the molecular geometry of onset superconductivity in both gold monofilaments and DNA monofilaments. So the actual spiral path curve that this follows is mapping for you the onset of superconductivity in non-cryogenic materials like gold threads and DNA threads. And that actually, there's a project on that, Tom Sawyer, Buffalo, New York International Conference on Superconductivity many years ago. And I personally learned this jitterbug from Buckminster Fuller. Now, if you continue this jitterbug, note I have the two opposing triangles, flat, plane, parallel, and perpendicular. Cubocta, ecosa, dodeca, octa, and I simply rotated and kept flat and plane parallel those two triangles, and now I have tetra. That tetra has 7 axes or arrows of spin symmetry, defining dimension. And the 7 arrows are, you have 4 through the vertex face center pair, and then 3 other through edge center, opposite edge center pairs. For a total of 7 arrows, which is the physics of the origin, heart muscle, Hebrew, and lots of other fun stuff, not to mention DNA codons. Now, tetracubic symmetry causes an internal lattice structure electrically based on the cube, powers of 2. That creates an electric field where when waves inside that structure add and multiply, they would create destructive electrical interference. So the waves are prevented from distributing charge. In other words, tetracubic 7-axial spin symmetries are perfect charge isolators, but bad charge distributors. This is a very, very profound subject, which I highly recommend, and it's a good introduction to hydrogen. That if you interfere an infinite number of waves in powers of 2, we call the octave, and summate what remains for constructive versus destructive interference, you find one simple physics, and that is powers of 2 ratio, the octave and the square root of 2. On top, I'll do that with my cursor here for the remote audience. Here's the octave, and here's the square root of 2. At those ratios, when waves meet, you create maximum destructive wave interference. That doesn't mean a cube is evil, no, but it does mean that when waves get locked in a tetra and a cube, they are prevented from changing. They're prevented from adding and multiplying. So the charge is frozen, stored, isolated, called incubation, held apart, made separate. So the tetracube, or part of your house, is where you want secrets. Or Mother Nature uses the hex of the beehive for storage, not distribution, storage. So the 7-spin part of that slip knot on the outside of the anu was the charge container. On the inside, you had the 5-spin symmetry. That's the opposite. That's the pen. So here on the left of this screen, if you're facing the screen, on the left I have the tetracubic lattice structure. And those lattice structures are charge isolators. On the right, I have the 5-10 spin symmetries, and those are golden mean ratio. Golden spiral pen generates golden mean ratio. And indeed, if we look on the top, this is the lesson that Einstein missed. If he'd figured this out, we'd have a unified field today. Absolutely. And the lesson is simple. If you interfere an infinite number of waves, at the golden mean ratio between the waves, you find maximum constructive interference. Top center. Simple physics, whether it's electric, magnetic, optical, it doesn't matter. If you want maximum constructive interference, use golden ratio. If you want maximum destructive interference, use the octave. There's some lessons from musicians here we don't have time for at the moment, but believe me, it's profound. Okay? So, the pen symmetry is great. Constructive interference, and therefore, efficient distribution of waves. Yeah? So, if you were Mother Nature, you could design a slip knot, which is a container on the outside and a distributor on the inside, and that's called 7 spins, 5 spins, the anu. And that's what we're talking about in the heart of hydrogen. Now, why do we have to go through all of this in order to talk about hydrogen energy sources, right? Well, see, this is, I'm just showing the 7 spins, 5 spins, this became the O'Fein-Minokian. This is actually the clue to the symmetry of human heart muscle. Many of you have heard me tell this story before. The layers of the human heart muscle on the outside are the axial spin symmetries of the tetra. That's why 7 layers, discretely dissectable, as in Petroglyphs work in vortex of light fields of form. Whereas in the center of the heart, you have the pen symmetry. This is the projector, this is the container. And That is the archetype of that slip knot. And that's why we see that Gordian knot, Anu, identically at the center of hydrogen, at the center of human heart muscle, and as clairvoyantly seen at the heart of the sun, and as we'll later learn if we have time, that the hydrogen's braid symmetries, that DNA's braid symmetries are done exactly that way. Actually, you see the thread inside DNA has 5 spins, and then that thread is braided 7 times recursively as it thickens. And that's the slip knot when the DNA becomes toroidal, and you have the 12 superposed axes of rotation, not 12 threads in DNA, you actually have the whole turning inside out phenomenon. Okay, that's as much as we're going to do about the background. I just wanted to give you a little flavor for how beautiful hydrogen is. Okay. Thank you. Get my microphone aligned. Thank you for aligning me, Paul. That's good. So now we're going to apply this. So let's look at hydrogen technologies. Now, in our project, we said that we could reinvent hydrogen energy sources by understanding the fractal implosive nature of hydrogen. For example, when I took the Planck length times golden ratio precisely to get the 3 radii of hydrogen precisely in the equation I was lucky enough to find, as described on the web at goldenmean.info/goldenproof. I did one more thing. I took the Planck time constant, the unit of time corresponding to the unit of length, which physics considers sacred because it divides evenly into everything in physics. For example, you can take Planck time times golden ratio precisely and get the solar year. I invented that equation. And you can also take the Planck time times golden ratio precisely and get the Venus year. And you can take the Planck time times golden ratio precisely and get the splitting frequencies of hydrogen. The hydrogen frequencies that we put at goldenmean.info/goldenproof, the physics of the origin of coincidence at goldenmean.info/coincidence. So time is a name for charge rotating. That periodicity of rotating charge defines time, and the inertia of that rotating charge defines mass. So rotating charge is pretty much the only thing physics has to discuss here. Now, because, well, and I need to tell you one more thing. I took precisely the wavelength of Planck times golden ratio from which I derived hydrogen to create the frequency recipe, which I'm going to tell you about tomorrow, where we created 50% change in fermentation. So this is absolutely central to the structure of all of matter, is to understand Planck times golden ratio, both in time and in space. Specifically, I can say to you, I'm absolutely convinced that the only way any wave system can emerge from chaos is fractality, both in time and space. You see, when we're talking about coincidence, that for charge to be transferred between rotating systems, the physics of coincidence, if you will, golden mean ratio would idealize that charge transfer.